Welcome to A Growing Concern. Tonight we're going to have a deep conversation with somebody about the free trade, specifically the Trans Pacfic Partnership. It's good timing too because we're just the 22nd. We're just a week away from the 20th anniversary, the 14th anniversary of the WTO meeting in Seattle that put fair trade on the map pretty much. And also we're 20 years now that we've been suffering under NAFTA. Some people wouldn't consider it suffering, but I know there's a million farmers in Mexico that have lost their farms, and there's you could go on and on with all the problems that NAFTA has caused. And this Trans Pacfic Partnership is cut from the same cloth. In fact, it's been called NAFTA on steroids. And we're going to be interviewing Elizabeth Swagger, who she's with the Oregon Fair Trade Campaign, and that is their job. They're working on trying to make this free trade a fair trade deal. And so welcome to the program, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Jim.
All right. Did I get anything wrong?
No, I think you got it exactly right.
All right. Well, we're gonna fill in a lot of the details. So the Trans Pacfic Partnership, obviously, it's probably more than one country. So what exactly is it?
So the Trans Pacfic Partnership is a massive free trade agreement being negotiated currently between 12 countries in the Pacific Rim. Those countries include the U.S., Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Peru, Mexico, and Canada. And just amongst those 12 countries, this is already one of the biggest free trade agreements ever negotiated. Those countries represent 40% of the total global economy.
And did I read it right that they're even leaving it open for other countries to join in?
No, that's absolutely right. The way that this is being negotiated is as a docking agreement, which allows for other countries to join on over time, and really those countries are going to be pressured to do so.
I think that's what has happened in the past. Wasn't there a lot of pressure on South American countries a few years back to join in, and I think it was stopped by activists, and then they just started putting them on one at a time?
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to focus on, because a lot of people do see the Trans Pacfic Partnership as a response to the very successful protests around the World Trade Organization and the WTO. That was a way for corporations to try and get every country to come together on the corporate agenda. And after the battle in Seattle in 1999, that really has been at a standstill ever since. So since then, corporations have teamed up with governments and really pushed governments to cherry pick countries that are more likely to go along with deregulation and a process of trade that isn't going to be for the people. It's going to be for the benefit of corporations. But by cherry picking a certain amount of countries to go along with it, then they can put pressure on the rest of the countries to follow
get the
through.
ones that are leaning that way already, probably. You use the word deregulation, and to me that's what this is all about. It's about changing the regulations for unions and laborers and environmental, which is standing in the way of the free access to these countries for multinational corporations.
That's absolutely right. I mean, another reason that corporations are so excited to get to a massive trade deal like the Trans Pacfic Partnership is because it makes it easier for them to ship jobs to wherever labor is cheapest anywhere around the world, and also wherever environmental regulations are the most relaxed. So it's a way of driving up corporate profits while driving down environmental standards and wages for workers around the world.
So is that in a nutshell what happened with NAFTA? What the objection is?
Absolutely. So NAFTA is really, since NAFTA passed, we have 20 years of failed trade policy to show, what this type of corporate trade policy means for people. So for people in Mexico, as you mentioned briefly before, there was 2.5 million Mexican farmers that were displaced by NAFTA.
A lot bigger than I remembered it, yeah.
And the reason why they were displaced is because you had these giant agricultural companies in the U.S. that were being subsidized and then flooding the markets, which were open after NAFTA, with this cheap, subsidized, artificially priced corn and other grains that the farmers in Mexico just couldn't compete with. And that forced them off of their land into maquiladoras, which grew because of the jobs leaving the U.S. And going to Mexico to these sweatshop factories, the maquiladoras. So you had people, having to leave their farms that were once sustainable, going to work in sweatshops. And those jobs after some years also got outsourced, and so it's certainly contributed to migration to the U.S. because there's people just trying to feed their families that are victims of these free trade policies.
And I think, what was it, some of the problems in this country was textiles, I think, was one of the ones that the industries that suffered under NAFTA?
Certainly textiles, many manufacturing industries were impacted by these free trade agreements. And really, our manufacturing base in this country has nearly been destroyed. And there's some people that have this belief that those are low-paying jobs and we didn't really need those jobs. Those were family wage, often unionized jobs. And when those jobs went away, it put pressure on all of the jobs that remained. So, for people who are firefighters or policemen or teachers, they have jobs that can't be offshored. But there's this ever-growing pool of unemployed workers that are also victims of these free trade policies that are also competing for the same job, which puts pressure on wages, and it makes it easier for companies to cut benefits.
And it also knocks the bottom out of the municipal tax, the taxes that everybody brings in. If you don't bring those taxes in, you can't provide the services. So it's a domino effect, it seems like.
Absolutely. So your schools, your libraries, fire departments, those are all suffering because of this lack of tax revenue from income that would be coming from these family wage jobs that we've lost.
So obviously, the folks that have the money to invest, the venture capitalists and all them, they profited from this, and they were in Washington lobbying under Clinton and all that, and he signed it. Is there anybody in the middle class or even lower than that were able to profit from the NAFTA at all? Because we can also extrapolate towards the DPP and see they'll be the same thing.
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head that it was really the corporate elite, the 1% that benefited from this free trade agreement. And, relating it back to the Trans Pacfic Partnership, that's who we see that's really at the table negotiating. So the Trans Pacfic Partnership, besides being one of the largest free trade agreements ever negotiated, like we mentioned earlier, it's also one of the most secretive trade deals to date. The U.S. Trade Representative's office has refused to tell the public what is being negotiated in our name. So the people that are most impacted, farmers, workers, are being left in the dark about what is in the U.S. proposals. So at the same time, we have 600 corporate lobbyists that have access to the negotiating text, but they also have the ear of the negotiators. They're at the negotiations. They're meeting for coffee with negotiators, and so they're making it very, very clear what they would like to see in the text. And 600 lobbyists. That's a lot of lobbyists. We also have about 30. non-lobbyists that are official advisors as well, so they're from labor or consumer rights backgrounds. But when you compare that to the 600, it's very clear who's going to have the loudest voice.
Mm-hmm. I understand that Barbara Dudley was talking about this one time, and she said that, you know, they go to the table, and you know, a country like, say, Chile or whoever will have 3 negotiators, and the United States will have 50, and that's why it always seems to go down that road. And I don't know how anything can be done about it.
Well, that is kind of my job. So
right, yeah, that's kind of what
I have a few ideas there.
So I'm moving in your direction here.
So Oregon Fair Trade Campaign is the organization that I direct, and we work on fighting NAFTA-style job-killing free trade agreements. At the same time, we work to promote a positive vision of international trade. Unfortunately, so often we're on the defensive when we're faced with a massive trade deal that is so clearly going to benefit corporations at the expense of everyone else. You know, we have no choice but to fight.
To fight that.
So that's what we do. And we do that in a couple of ways. One is by reaching out to our coalition members. You know, it's labor unions, environmental organizations that we work with, community organizations, immigrant rights groups. And they reach out to our members of Congress. They are putting in calls regularly, going to meetings, doing delegations, and asking them to stand with their constituents and vote the right way on these trade deals, and speak out for the lack of transparency around these free trade agreements, so that we know what's being negotiated in our names, and we're not left in the dark and then have a free trade agreement hit the floor of Congress and just get pushed through under the radar. At the same time, we also work very much with grassroots, and so we work on doing things like educational events where we'll hold community forums and workshops. We will organize people to write letters to the editor, op-eds. We'll do phone banks to have constituents call their members of Congress, which is incredibly important. And I would urge everyone watching to do this. You know, that it's when we're going to town hall meetings and letting our members of Congress know how important it is that they're following this, that they're speaking out, and that they're challenging the U.S. Trade Representative and President Obama on the total lack of transparency and these closed-door negotiations.
Mm-hmm. We can do a takeoff on that because they're not so opaque anymore. They're a little bit more transparent, thanks to a fellow named Julian Assange. And we have a little clip. Actually, it's a 20-minute clip, and we're going to play a little bit of it later. But we'll play the first part of it, which is Julian Assange talking about this exact subject and what he did to make things a little bit more transparent for us all.
Is back in the news after it published Wednesday part of the secret text of a massive new trade pact called the Trans Pacfic Partnership, or TPP. For the past several years, the United States and 12 Pacific Rim nations have been negotiating behind closed doors on the sweeping agreement. On Wednesday, WikiLeaks released a 95-page draft of a TPP chapter focusing on intellectual property rights. WikiLeaks editor-in-chief Julian Assange appeared in a YouTube video Tuesday talking about the leak.
We released today the secret intellectual property chapter, what they call intellectual property, but it's actually all about how to extend the monopoly rights of companies like Monsanto, which has genetic patents over wheat and corn, extending the ability of Disney to criminally prosecute people for downloading films, prosecute internet service providers. Japan introducing something they call a patent prosecution highway, Japan has. And so we released all their secret negotiating positions for all 12 countries.
The WikiLeaks release of the text comes a week before a TPP chief negotiators summit in Salt Lake City, Utah. President Obama and U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman reportedly wish to finalize the TPP by the end of the year and are pushing Congress to expedite legislation that grants the president what's known as fast-track authority. However, this week, some 151 House Democrats and 23 Republicans wrote letters to the administration saying they're unwilling to give the president free rein to, quote, diplomatically legislate. Well, for more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we host a debate on the Trans Pacfic Partnership. Bill Watson's trade policy analyst at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, and Lori Wallach, the director of the fair trade group Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Bill Watson, why do you support the TPP?
Well, we need to remember when we see some of these reports about the intellectual property chapter, we need to remember that the free trade agreements are about fundamentally something very different. They are about free trade, and the value of free trade, I think, is really incontrovertible. The United States has been lowering its barriers for 50 years. To engage in the global economy in a way that increases growth economically, that improves the quality of life of people in the United States. We still have a number of protectionist measures in the United States that an agreement like the TPP will address. Particular to Asia that are of interest in this agreement are tariffs, quotas, and subsidies dealing with things like footwear and clothing, consumer items that these barriers really act as taxes on the poor, mostly, who end up paying a larger portion of their income, to support an economic policy that benefits a select few. The protectionist measures in place, these trade barriers, are special interest handouts to big businesses that have good lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. The purpose of a free trade agreement is to overcome an inherent political difficulty in getting rid of those barriers. We know we want to get rid of the barriers, but it's hard to counteract these special interests because they have a lot of influence in Congress. So the idea of a reciprocal free trade agreement where the U.S. lowers its barriers and in exchange other countries lower theirs is a way to gain special interest support for the free trade agreement, that U.S. industries that benefit from export access abroad will lobby. They have a concentrated benefit in the agreement, and so they will counteract the special interests that are supporting the existing barriers. The end result, ideally, is open markets at home and abroad, and this is a very good outcome. The problem at this point, if you could say there's a problem.
Bill Watson, if we can bring in Lori Wallach to respond to some of your comments, especially in terms of we've had lots of publicity over pharmaceuticals and the huge disparities in prices of pharmaceuticals around the globe, and how this might affect under the TPP agreement. Lori?
Well, free trade is a pretty theory, but as yesterday's WikiLeaks showed, the TPP has very little to do with free trade. So only 5 of the 29 chapters of the agreement even have to do with trade at all. What's in that intellectual property chapter? What the Cato Institute would call rent-seeking, governments being lobbied by special interests to set up special rules that give them monopolies to charge higher prices. What does that mean for you and me? In that agreement, we now can see the United States is pushing for longer monopoly patents for medicines that would increase the prices here. They're looking for patenting things like surgical procedures, making even higher medical costs. They're looking to patent life forms and seeds. And with respect to copyright, the U.S. positions are actually even undermining U.S. law. So for internet freedom, if you didn't like SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, the domestic law that Congress, in amazing citizen activism, killed last year when it was attempted to be pushed here domestically, huge chunks of SOPA are pushed through the back door of this intellectual property chapter. Now, what the heck is that doing in a free trade agreement? I would imagine the Cato Institute is also wondering, are Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the free trade philosophers, rolling in their graves? Because that is protectionism. This is patent monopolies. This is copyright extensions. This is actually exactly what Bill just talked about, which is powerful special interests, big pharma, Disney and the other big content guys, undermining us as consumers, our access to the internet, our access to affordable medicine, and they're using their power to put that into an agreement that they've got misbranded as free trade. That's what's the real TPP. So maybe actually we agree between the consumer group, Public Citizen, and Cato that what's in TPP, whatever you think about free trade, ain't so good for most of us.
This is a rare occasion where I do agree.
Back here. Elizabeth mentioned a little bit about part of the things that her organization does is to provide community access to information, and there is a forum coming up, right?
That's right. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, we have a community forum on the Trans Pacfic Partnership coming up on December 7th, Sunday, December 7th, from 2 to 4 p.m. at the First Unitarian Church, the Elliott Chapel. We are going to hear from a panel of speakers, including David Delk from the Alliance for Democracy. He'll be focused on what the Trans Pacfic Partnership is going to mean for democracy, particularly looking at how the language profits corporations through investor rights. So there's an investor chapter in the Trans Pacfic Partnership that basically allows corporations to sue a local government for a law, regulation, or even court decision that they feel impedes on their ability to make future profits. We'll also hear from Greg Pallison, who is the vice president of the Association of Western Pulp and Paper Workers, a wonderful union that represents workers in the pulp and paper industry that's been just devastated from free trade agreements. Every site that has closed down since NAFTA passed has been certified by the U.S. Labor Department as being related to trade. So that means that their jobs were either directly offshored or they were displaced by imports from countries we have free trade agreements with. We will also hear from a representative from the Climate Justice Committee, and they're going to make the link between free trade agreements and the threat that it places on laws we put in place to prevent climate catastrophes like what we saw in the Philippines 2 weeks ago with the devastating typhoon there. We'll also have a MC from the faith community to talk about how the faith community views the Trans Pacfic Partnership. So we'll hear from Joseph Santos Lyons, minister at the Unitarian Church and director of Apano.
Now, these are all really specific, subcategories of the Trans Pacfic Partnership that they kind of both touched a little bit on what this is all about, and people need to drill down a lot actually, in order to find out how this relates. And I know you yourself was saying that you wanted to speak a little bit yourself about the intellectual property, which I keep hearing it and I kind of know what it is, and then it kind of goes away. What exactly is that? I know they mentioned patents. They want to patent life forms and seeds. Is that what the intellectual property means?
That is what it's essentially about. So the chapter that WikiLeaks released on intellectual property focuses on mainly patents. It's something that Big Pharma has really been pushing hard for and lobbying hard for, because it would essentially extend the life of drug patents. And they'll do that in a number of ways. One is through data exclusivity, which allows for a drug company to limit how much information or when they put out information on their drug trials. So that makes it harder for developing countries that have companies producing generics to be able to get that information and produce the drugs in an affordable way. Beyond that, they would also allow corporations to use a process called evergreening, and that is where a drug company will have a drug, say, for headaches, and then they do a little bit of research and they find out, oh, well, this drug could also be used to increase hair growth, and therefore it's got a new use, and therefore it gets a new patent. So beyond the 20 years that are what's set as the lifetime of a drug patent under TRIPS, they're extending it beyond that. And you know what that means is that the price of drugs increase for people here, and what it means for people in developing countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, people who are facing life-threatening diseases like HIV and tuberculosis. This is essentially a death sentence for people who can't afford name brand medication.
And does the government have agencies in place that would test it to make sure that it did what these, makes their hair grow or whatever other use this would have? Would the government really check it? Because they don't really check a lot of the FDA. They don't check a lot of genetically engineered foods to make sure they're safe. So would they really follow up on that?
Well, I think I think your question gets to the heart of is that it's corporations that are really writing the rules. So, if there's, if they're able to avoid regulations, then they put that into the trade deal that doesn't have to go through the regular processes of what it would take to pass a law. And so that's what these trade deals do. They allow corporations to avoid regulation and to be able to write the rules that allow them to make the most profits possible. So that, in this case, with the intellectual property chapter, is extending the life of drug patents.
Right. And, viewers just want to think about what just happened up in Washington and not too long ago in California. And even before that, what happened in Oregon with the genetic engineered labeling. The corporations that I think Assange even mentioned, Monsanto and the big drug companies, they can go in there and throw a lot of money. And when the people try to mount campaigns that want to provide the oversight over companies, whatever kind, they get slapped down because they spend $40 million. I think $40 million in California and 8 or something in Washington, and it's the same players that are keeping us from mounting initiatives to get what we want accomplished, that are wanting to pass this Trans Pacfic Partnership. Seemed to me it would be the same players. I mean, one was mentioned there, but I'm sure there's a lot more.
Yeah. And after the WikiLeaks release on the Trans Pacfic Partnership, there has been a lot more controversy around the trade deal. One news agency that has been traditionally pro-free trade, the Washington Post, had a really strong statement about the lack of transparency, really, with the Trans Pacfic Partnership.
They're not left-wing newspaper.
They're certainly not, and I would really love to read that to folks. What they wrote is that it's obvious why the U.S. Trade Representative and the Obama administration have insisted on secrecy for the Trans Pacfic Partnership. From this text, it appears that the U.S. administration is negotiating for intellectual property provisions that it knows it could not achieve through an open democratic process.
That pretty well says it right there.
It really does. And you know, they're not the only ones speaking out. Just last week, we heard from 150 Democrats, House Democrats across the country, who wrote a letter to the president and to the U.S. Trade Representative opposing fast-track legislation. So fast track is federal legislation that's been around since the Nixon era. And basically what it does is it allows for a free trade agreement to be pushed through Congress without the regular debate and amendment process. So it allows the executive branch to sign this trade deal before anyone has seen any of the negotiating text, and then they present it to Congress for a take it or leave it vote. That, you know, it would be impossible to make any changes to this free trade agreement, no matter, you know, what the horrific consequences would be.
So in the past, when this has been brought up, have they ever left it, or they always take it?
They have voted against fast track before. Fast track has actually expired, and it expired in 2007. So they would need to renew it, and they only pull out fast track when there's a big controversial free trade agreement like the Trans Pacfic Partnership. So, you know, our opposition has been pushing really hard for this for fast track to be put in place. Because if people knew what was in this free trade agreement, if Congress knew and had time to study what this is going to mean for food sovereignty, what it's going to mean for family wage jobs, for consumer rights, wanting to know where our food's coming from, and labeling country of origin. If they knew all of this, there's no way that the free trade agreement with the Trans Pacfic Partnership would pass.
So we got to thank Julian Assange for shining the light. He how many pages did he release? I don't recall. Did he mention?
The chapter's 95 pages long. But
that's just one chapter.
That's one chapter. And there are 29 chapters. So these are thick, these are really thick free trade agreements. And we really need our members of Congress to be studying these things the whole time. It's really only been recently that members of Congress have had any access to the negotiating text. And there's debate as to how much access they really have.
Well, you know, I forget how many days they've worked this year, but they're supposed to work 119 days next year. So no wonder they don't have any time. They're too busy playing golf or whatever, something like that. But, you know, Lori mentioned that there was only 5 pages in this 29, I think 5 chapters or whatever out of 29 that have to do with the actual free trade. Mm-hmm. What does the rest have to do with?
Well, traditional free trade is about breaking down tariffs and barriers to trade. The rest of it are everything that we've been talking about, the intellectual property rights, the chapter that allows Monsanto to patent seeds, the internet freedom, all of these things that really have nothing to do with trade but allow corporations to have more power than they would if they attempted to pass laws on their own in countries.
Mm-hmm. I know years ago I watched a video, I forget the name of it now, unfortunately, but it's been, 15 years, on how they're patenting life. They're taking blood samples from natives in South America and trying to get patents on those. They'll go into places in India and try to get patents on a food that they have been eating there for 5,000 years. And this is the kind of thing that the TPP would facilitate this happening, it would seem to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's, the intellectual property rights with drugs and things like that are pretty scary. But when they're starting to patent seeds and foods, it's putting the people of the planet in a thraldom. to me.
Yeah, and basically what it does with these free trade agreements is it takes power out of the hands of citizens and the community and puts it into the hands of corporations. And you know, I think that's really reflected in another chapter that was leaked from the Trans Pacfic Partnership negotiations, and that's the chapter on investment. So as I mentioned a little earlier, this is the chapter that focuses on you know, foreign corporations, giving them the right to sue our local democracies for any laws or regulations or court decisions that could possibly impact their profits, their bottom line. And we've seen many, many cases of this. We have seen in Peru, there was a U.S. corporation running a smelter, which is a processing plant where you separate lead from glass. It's a recycling plant. And this smelter had opened up operations under the agreement that they would take care of any pollution that they put out. That's not what they did. So instead, lead was being released into the air, and children in this community were being born with neurological diseases. And instead of taking care of the problem and doing as they promised and cleaning up their pollution, when the community protested and got the government to pretty much dismiss their permit for the operation, the company then used a free trade agreement to challenge Peru in an international tribunal. And these tribunals are made up of 3 trade lawyers that rotate out. So one day they're defending corporations, and then the next day they're the judge. And so if the corporation wins and the country loses, then the country has to pay a huge fine, taxpayer dollars, of course. And if they don't want to be fined again and again, sued again and again, then they need to change the laws.
And that has happened in a lot of other instances too, and it's usually with poorer countries. But you know, Peru knew about this going in, and these other countries knew about it going in. But there is an indication of the strong-arm tactics that are being used against, in this instance, Peru, in order to sign on to this bill to begin with, or whatever it's called. Is it called a bill? No, it's a partnership.
Free trade agreement, or trade pact.
There we go. Yeah. So they sign on to these, and the people have nothing to say about it.
Yeah, and you know, it's the same problem that I think we see in most of the world, and certainly here too. You have the elite, the 1% that are really pushing the government and driving the government. And you know, I think in this country and in many countries, it's our responsibility to take that power back. And you know, that's what we do when we go out and we lobby our members of Congress and demand that they speak out for us.
You know, in the instance of Peru, I don't know the story behind that, but I know in a lot of countries, a lot of this is going in there and extracting resources. Now, they may not have been getting the ore or whatever from Peru to get the lead or whatever was going on there, but a lot of this is if they have laws, environmental laws, to keep companies from extracting resources, whether that be lumber or minerals or whatever, they can't stop them from pillaging their country.
Yeah.
Do I got that right?
I think that's right, and there's other examples such as the Pacific Rim mining case, where a Canadian company was running a mining operation in El Salvador, and under CAFTA, they sued the government because the government just tried to enforce their environmental laws. So instead of allowing the corporation to pollute the drinking water of the nearby villages, they were demanding they clean it up. And the corporations felt that that was impeding on their ability to make profits. And so they took it to this foreign tribunal under CAFTA.
which is Central America Free Trade Agreement instead of North American Free Trade Agreement.
That's right.
Yeah, so, and these trade agreements have been going on for some time. I know we recently signed one with South Korea that your organization was trying to stop, and Colombia. Did that one ever go through?
That one did go through, and since then we've seen, I think it was 20,000 farmers in Colombia that took to the streets protesting the already outrageous impact of U.S. subsidized agriculture flooding Colombia. Colombia is a country that most of their agriculture comes from small farms, and those are thousands and thousands of people who are losing their livelihoods.
Well, I looked up and we got 18 minutes of the program left, and I think there's more of that than the video that we had time. Because time just flew past. We might talk a little bit more about the. This is interesting to folks out there. There's going to be a community forum on December 7th, which I think is Pearl Harbor Day. That is going to go a little bit deeper into some of these issues and from different perspectives. You might kind of run that down a little bit again so folks would know about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's a community forum on the Trans Pacfic Partnership. We're going to have a speakers panel starting at 2 o'clock. We'll go for an hour and hear from labor leaders and environmentalists, faith leaders in our community on their reflections on the Trans Pacfic Partnership. Then we'll break out into different groups and talk about how this is going to impact things like climate change, what we can do about the Trans Pacfic Partnership. We'll also have a breakout group that will focus on TPP free zone. And what that is there's been a few cities and counties throughout the country that have said if the Trans Pacfic Partnership passes, then we will not acknowledge it and we will not obey it. So this is a great way of going into the community, getting different people involved, and also getting a lot of attention around the issue. So if that's something you're interested in, you can join that group. We'll also have a group working on international solidarity. What can we be doing to work in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in countries around the world who have free trade agreements and those people in the 12 countries represented by the Trans Pacfic Partnership. Sure. So again, that's going to be Saturday, December 7th from 2 to 4 at the First Unitarian Church, the Elliott Chapel.
Well, these trade agreements, I mean, they don't affect just the countries that sign up. They affect, larger areas, if not the whole planet. But with 40, would you say it was 40% of the world's trade are going to be reflected in the countries, the 12 countries that are initially supposed to sign on to this? That's going to affect the whole planet. Whether it's environmental laws, I mean, it's race to the bottom, is often said, and that's exactly what will happen. These 12 countries will have less powerful, enforceable environmental and labor laws. And I know I've heard that half the people that are murdered in labor situations are murdered in Colombia. And so that's just going to make that even worse, I suppose. And if you lower your profile of the laws in countries that have good environmental laws, it's just going to make it worse. I mean, it made it worse here. The United States has been sued by the WTO or through the WTO or through these free trade agreements as well, haven't they?
Well,
it doesn't matter how big a country you are. It isn't just Peru. I think we sued Canada. Canada sued us over the UPS, I think.
That's absolutely right. And it brings up a good point that, I think you mentioned earlier that a lot of the investor rights challenges have happened in smaller countries. And that makes sense because we have these big multinational corporations from the U.S. going and investing in smaller countries because they can take advantage of low wages and relaxed environmental regulations. However, that's going to be different now that we have the if we were to pass the Trans Pacfic Partnership, because those small countries don't have investment in the U.S. But with the TPP, we have member countries like Japan that has huge investments throughout the U.S. So the potential is definitely there to challenge our laws and regulations as well. Mm-hmm. And I think you're absolutely right that what we're seeing here is a way of setting the global standards. So even if countries don't join on, if we have 40% of the total global economy represented with these 12 countries, other countries are going to be forced to adopt these same standards of deregulation and privatization, and basically corporate power over people power.
Mm-hmm. Like I mentioned, it's like the 14th anniversary of the WTO, and I remember some of the statistics that were being thrown around back then, and some of the names and faces might have changed, but I think back then they were saying that the largest economies on the planet, the top 6 were countries, and I think the 5th or 6th is California now, and then the next one after that is a corporation. I don't remember which one it is. So we're looking at economies of corporations that are as big as maybe not the top 5 or 6 or 7 countries on the planet, but they're huge. And like Walmart has over 1 million employees or something like that. And these companies, they're not just corporations. They're extremely powerful entities, and they are struggling to become more powerful. And the only thing standing in their way are organizations like Elizabeth's and individuals who want to stand up and try to make a difference. And one of their main conduits is through their representatives, as I see it.
Absolutely. And when people do stand up, we do win. We have some huge victories in trade justice under our belts, and one we've already mentioned, the battle in Seattle. The WTO has not been able to get back on track after we stalled the trade talks in Seattle in 1999, and since then, we've also been able to organize across borders and stop the free trade area of the Americas.
I was just thinking that, the FTAA. Right.
Absolutely. So, it's been proven that if we join together and we organize in our communities and we reach out to members of Congress, we are able to do amazing things to challenge corporations that, as you say, are as large as countries. It just takes all of us coming together and fighting these things.
And what it takes is for people to educate themselves. And if people don't have time, they have kids, they have jobs, they have lack of job security. But and I've often said in the past, and it may sound a little bit hyperbolic, but World War III is going to be between democracy and the corporations, and it's unfolding that way, because this planet can only belong to one master, and if it isn't going to be democracy, it's going to be large mercantile outfits, and that seems to be what's going on. They want to be able to control the apportionment of resources and labor, and the only thing that can stop them are the people who are under the gun, and that's us. And folks out there in TV land, I mean, you might think, well, how this does not affect me, but boy, doesn't it affect them? Everybody, it seems like. Trade affects everybody. And we're not saying not to trade. Trade is probably important. I mean, through history, trade was how culture and inventions and everything is moved. But it can also be a way to screw things down to where we have less freedom.
Yeah, and really, that's what we envision, is that we want trade policy that benefits people and that levels the playing field for workers around the world and raises boats. But unfortunately, for the last 20 years, we've seen just the opposite.
That's true. So heck, we're down to 9 minutes. I know you said that you really weren't able to do the hour, but it looks like we did. So we could just continue, play a little bit more of that, or we could open up the phones and see if folks have any questions. However you feel like doing it. Put you on the spot here.
Yeah.
Because things didn't work. I never saw time melt away so fast as it did tonight. But we do have some of that video we could play, and then you could move along then.
Well, you know, I did actually. I had a meeting after this, so I think
it'd be good to move along then. So, well, we hope we've had enough information out here to wet your whistle. Well, we got about it. You know, we can play about 8 minutes more of the Democracy Now!, which I think was great. They talk a little bit more in depth, and maybe touch on some of the things we talked about. Maybe touch on a few other things. So we'll move along, and then we'll be back in 2 weeks because next weekend is the holiday weekend, and I'll be out of town. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.
This is a rare occasion where I do agree with Lori Wallach. I agree that what's going on in the IP chapter is a special interest free-for-all, a grab bag. U.S. companies are pushing to get what they want in these agreements. And the problem really with that is that intellectual property is not a trade issue, and it shouldn't be in the agreement. Originally, adding intellectual property into the agreement was a way to bring on more political support, to be able to bring in U.S. companies to counter other U.S. companies that would oppose the agreement. At this point, I think we've gotten to where the intellectual property chapters are so expansive that what you're seeing is a domestic constituency, people concerned about copyright and patent reform, who are opposing the TPP, not because of anything having to do with trade, but just because it's going to reform U.S. copyright and patent laws. What I would say is that we need to have a renewed focus within these trade agreements to be more about free trade and less about some of these other issues like intellectual property rights.
But Bill Watson, why should we even have to depend on WikiLeaks to provide information on what's in this proposed agreement? Isn't the actual just the super secrecy under which this agreement has been worked out raise questions for ordinary citizens about why all the secrecy?
I'm certainly glad that WikiLeaks published this report. Personally, I like to be able to read it. It's very interesting. I wish that they would publish the rest of it to show us the rest of the draft text. I don't think that it would be, at this point, particularly harmful to the agreement to let us know something about the country's negotiating positions. But I really disagree that the TPP negotiations are especially secret. There's a lot that goes on in Congress that the public doesn't know about. When Congress writes a law, we don't know in advance what it's going to be before it gets proposed. So they're still trying to figure out what the contents of the agreement will be. They don't know yet. They're working on it. So eventually we'll see something. We'll see it well in advance of when it becomes law, and Congress will have a chance to decide to vote yes or no on the agreement.
Lori Wallach, what most surprised you about seeing the TPP agreement for the first time yesterday, the WikiLeaks leak?
Well, first of all, this is extraordinarily secret. I've followed these negotiations since 1991 with NAFTA. And during NAFTA, any member of Congress could see any text. In fact, the whole agreement between negotiating rounds was put in the Capitol, accessible for them to look at. In 2001, the Bush administration published the entire free trade area of the Americas text, when it was even in an earlier stage than TPP is right now, on government websites. They've even excluded members of Congress from observing the negotiations. I mean, this is extraordinary. And so to me, what was the most horrifying, I would say, is the ways in which the U.S. negotiators are using this agreement to try and rewrite U.S. law. I mean, I find it morally repugnant and outrageous that the U.S. negotiators be pushing Big Pharma's agenda to raise medicine prices for the developing countries in the TPP. People in Vietnam, in all the developing countries that have HIV/AIDS, that have malaria, they need access to generic medicines, and this would cut it off. but they're actually doing it also to us. So to the extent theoretically they're sort of supposed to be representing our interests, it would make cancer drugs in this country more expensive. Evergreening of patents, changing just a little tweaky thing, the 6-hour versus 12-hour version of a medicine, you get 20 more years of monopoly. Also undermining our internet freedom by rewriting U.S. law. There's language in there where U.S. law says there's an exception for liability for U.S. internet service providers. The U.S. is the only country in that bracket that's saying, no, we shouldn't allow that in TPP. It's backdoor diplomatic legislating. And that ties into that business with fast track. Why were, and it's now 27 Republican members, because there was a second letter that came out of Republicans, and 151 Democrats, why were they all saying together in the last 36 hours, no fast-track trade process? We don't want to give away our constitutionally granted authority over trade policy. And a big piece of the reason is the left and the right in Congress may disagree on what the policy should be, but they actually believe that constitutionally Congress gets to write our legislation. So the notion of this backdoor legislating that we saw actually revealed in this WikiLeaks is precisely what is uniting, animating congressional outrage at the notion that after being left out of these negotiations uninformed, somehow they should volunteer to handcuff themselves so they can be thoroughly steamrollered and have even their legislating authority undermined through this so-called trade agreement that's really a backdoor coup d'etat on domestic policy
Bill
making.
Watson, might this be another place where you and Lori Wallach agree?
Not really. No, I see it on fast track. Let me just say that I don't have a lot of confidence in Congress's ability to come in and resist special interests and make good policies on these areas. But actually, fast track is a way for Congress to exert its influence over these agreements. When Congress passes fast track, it imposes a number of negotiating objectives. One of those, if Congress imposes fast track, is to have strong IP measures in the agreement. So you don't necessarily want Congress's input, if you're trying to get a good policy here, but you do get it through fast track, and you get increased transparency. Fast track will set the rules for who the president has to talk to and inform in Congress, and how Congress participates in the agreement. But let me also say, when Lori talks about how increased patent law on pharmaceuticals is going to harm people in poor countries like Vietnam, I'd like to point out also that trade barriers harm people in countries like Vietnam. Our trade barriers harm them. Their trade barriers harm them. It stunts the growth of their economy, prevents them from engaging in commerce that increases their quality of life. What we need to do is not ditch the free trade agreement because some parts of it are harmful. We need to get rid of the harmful parts and recognize the value of these agreements in improving quality of life around the world.
Lori Wallach?
I'm sorry. Right now, under the so-called trade authority system, there are 600 corporate advisors who, with the executive branch, are behind closed doors making these rules, seeing the text. I myself have much more faith in the U.S. Congress, the U.S. public, and the U.S. press, and the democratic process, with all of us who will live with the results, messy though democracy may be, having the ability to make sure these policies work for us. I don't want a bunch of unelected U.S. trade negotiators and 600 corporate advisors dictating my future through so-called trade agreements.